sold for a horse beneath a merciless frontier sky. She discovers a lifeline she never expected, and a love powerful enough to heal what life tried to break. Every dog slunk back under a lean-to. Eliza Mae Hargrove walked with her father that morning as if she were being ushered to some unavoidable reckoning. The town watched with the blunt curiosity of people who have time to knit stories for one another, while the world keeps bending them low. James Hargrove's boots scuffed the street, and his shoulders had the slump of a man who'd been whittled down by winter and a string of bad choices. He had the look of someone who'd measured his life in bad debts and rough luck, until he believed coin could cure the ache where love should have lived. When they stopped at the corral, the sorrel gelding stamped and tossed its mane as if it resented being a centerpiece of human misfortune. A man leaned against the rail, Garrett Hale of Red Horse Creek, a figure built for land and labor, rather than for townsmen's small talk. He had a duster flung back, a hat pulled low, and a calm in his gray eyes that fit the country around him like a good-fit saddle. James unfolded a paper with hands that trembled. The leather pouch of coins clinked against Garrett's palm, each ring a small, precise thing that made something larger turn and settle. "You mind him," James said, voice rough as burlap. "Make yourself useful. Don't give him cause to regret taking you." Words failed Eliza there in the dust. She could have screamed that a heart is not a thing to be counted like cattle, that the measure of a person is not in the weight of a purse. But what she had left to trade were only manners and the name she'd been given. "Eliza," she said, the one thing she could give that hadn't been weighed yet. Garrett's face showed nothing so grand as pity. At most there was the faintest tilt of recognition, like a man who had once been given a hard choice himself. He gave the sorrel a gentle pat, the animal's flanks warm under his hand. "You can call him Copper," he said, and his voice was even, not a ledger but a steadying thing. "You can call me Garrett." They rode out with Bitter Creek shrinking to a smudge of roofs and the cottonwoods along the creek looking like old fingers clasped in prayer. The land lay open and honest, sagebrush rolled like a gray sea, and the mountains kept a blue watch at the edge of the world. Garrett didn't fill the air with words. He pointed out a dry wash, the stand of aspens that held elk in winter, the knoll where a Cheyenne trail crossed long ago. His speech was short, precise, a man who loved the land's language and did not waste chatter. "Why'd you do it?" Eliza asked after a while, when the motion of Copper's hooves and the vastness of nothingness made a place for questions. "Why buy me?" He didn't answer right away. He adjusted his reins and let the silence do some of the talking. "Place is too big for one man," he said at last. "House gets mighty quiet. Got a barn, got work, got room. Can't habit seeing someone go hungry if I can help it." The honesty there was like a salve, though it didn't heal. It made the transaction less like a sale and more like an awkward rescue, or at least that's how she wanted to see it. "So you bought me to keep your house warm," she said, bitterness a thin thread at the edge of her words. Garrett's jaw moved. "Only part of it. You work for your keep. If you stay after you know the truth and like it all right. If you don't, you go where you please. I ain't buying a person's will with coin." That small, fiercely offered respect stunned her differently than any apology might have. The ride smoothed some of the rawness between them. Copper walked true and steady, and the farther they left town, the less the scene there seemed to belong to her. Red Horse Ranch lay in a shallow basin, a house stout with logs and a barn red with a paint that had been lived into. Cottonwoods marked where water ran, and the place smelled of wood smoke and feed. Garrett moved through his yard with the ease of a man who was at home with every nail and trough. She showed her a little room off the kitchen with a narrow bed and a patched quilt, and when he said, with a hesitance that made him seem almost small, that no one went in there but her, she felt the oddest relief, like the first time a person shows you where their heart keeps its keys. The first nights at Red Horse were filled with sounds she hadn't known how to miss until they were offered. The small clack of the hearth, the creak talking under a crust of ice, a dog's snore from the porch. Garrett read sometimes from an old book, with a voice that could be rough as a fence post, or soft as a child's prayer, depending on the sentence. He left small things, a stub of tallow candle, a mug of strong coffee, where she could find them like breadcrumbs leading her toward trust. She cooked from what he had, beans and pork and cornbread, hearty and honest, and the act of sharing food knitted a warmth between them that money could never have purchased. There were awkward moments too. Once, during a fierce storm, he came in sodden and stripped off his shirt without a thought for the proprieties of a new house guest. The scar down his ribs caught the lamplight like a pale moon. It was no scandalous revelation. It was just a man with a past, and seeing him unguarded made something in her uncoil. She saw him first as a man who took care of his animals and his property, then as someone who could also take care of her in ways that were not ledgered in coins. Trouble would come, as it does in places where men's greed can be as wide as the plains. Luke Travers rode up the valley with a swagger and a smile that looked sharp enough to cut. He had the town's muscle and the kind of influence that collects debts like trophies. He announced his claims, thinly veiled threats that called into question every arrangement that Garrett had made. He insisted the law would back him, that Eliza's coming to Red Horse was just a temporary ripple that could be smoothed by turning her over. Garrett's rifle rose as easily as a man draws a breath. "Eliza is no one's property," he said, and his voice had a gravity that made the wind seem small in comparison. Travers's smile tightened into a leer. "The law's plain," he said. "If she was part of paying off debts, then the debt's mine to collect." Travers's men relaxed their shoulders toward holsters. The ground between the men seemed to knit together with the sound of boot leather and low mutters. Then copper flame and smoke, a shot cracked, a man dropped, and a blast from the porch sent another lying in the dirt. Eliza had learned to shoot because her father tolerated guns better than he did his conscience. When the moment came, she'd stood and fired the shotgun from the porch with a recoil that bit and made her breath come short. Her aim was true, fierce as the first honest thing she'd done since being put up for sale. Travers retreated that day with a wounded pride and a hard promise in his mouth. He used what leverage he had. Buyers steered clear. The supply wagons slowed. A neighbor recalled how much he owed Travers for a loan 12 years gone and closed his eyes. Weeks congealed into a slow pressure on the ranch. Garrett rode and worked to find markets, returning thin and tight at the jaw. Eliza learned to stretch flour with the quiet genius of hunger. A little cornmeal in the bread, a bit less meat in the stew, and the days did not pass in famine, though the pantry slimmed. They adapted. Garrett had an eye for horses, and Eliza had patience as a method. Where Travers controlled cattle buyers through favors and friendships, the Hales shifted to training and breaking mounts, horses that could carry a mail rider through blizzards or a stagecoach across drainages without tossing the man who trusted them. Word traveled not by the big men's parlors, but by travelers and riders. A mail rider swore the gelding he bought held him true in a hailstorm. A cavalry sergeant, passing through, looked at the team with a practical eye and promised to mention them to the quartermaster. Business came, slow and steady, the kind you build by blood and honest sweat, rather than by the sweep of a rich man's hand. The slow days made room for other things. Garrett and Eliza learned one another's edges. He was not elegant with words. His love showed in deeds. Fixing a rung on the porch when she mentioned it broke her skirts, taking a turn to milk when she had stood at the barn too long, holding a hand across a table during a frayed, hungry argument. She learned to accept him in all his clumsy, gentled humanity, and to hold her own stubborn tongue when pride would make him blurt out a defense. They married not from convenience, but because the judge, a man who had once signed the paper that had sent her like merchandise, wanted to set it right. Judge Kenji Nakamura drew up a declaration. Eliza was not property. She married by choice, and any prior paper suggesting otherwise was void. Travers stormed into the office with deputies at his side, brow red and teeth bared. But the town's citizens stood quiet and firm. The very people Travers had leaned on for years turned their backs to his threats. A bully's reach has limits where community will not bow. The wedding was simple, a necklace of words rather than gold. They stood before the judge's desk, hands clasped, and pledged themselves. Garrett's I do came like a man lifting a burden and finding the weight worthwhile. Eliza's reply was a declaration born of hard-earned choice. The town applauded softly. More surprised than celebratory, the judge sealed the paper and tucked it into the records like a small victory for justice. Life after that was not a smooth road. Winters came with the same merciless logic they always had. A cough in a herd, a storm that snapped a fence, a calf lost to thin milk. There were nights when the cupboard was nearly bare and they measured the supply of flour in spoonfuls. Yet there were also mornings when the creek ran clearer than the year before. A colt learned to canter without launching his rider into the sky, and the laugh in the kitchen was enough medicine to apply to 1,000 aches. Their work, mending fences, training horses, riding out to check on distant waterholes, stitched a daily intimacy that was perhaps truer than any romantic theatrics. Each evening they came back to the same table and warmed a pot of stew and spoke of small things. A neighbor's child with a new tooth, a hawk that hovered too close, a story from the judge about a misplaced will. They loved in the honest way of people who have learned to hold tenderly because everything else can be so rough. Garrett learned to say sorry. When his temper flared, Eliza learned the soft arts of patience and of not using her tongue as a weapon when a gentler stitch would do. They quarreled, sometimes fierce as a spring storm, then reconciled over burnt cornbread and the quiet mutuality of chores.
There were nights when he would press his forehead to hers and whisper the most ordinary things.
Promises to stand between her and any man who meant to hurt her, to teach the boy next door how to tie a proper hitch, to keep their roof over their heads. She pressed her cheek to his and thought, often, of the absurdity of love's small miracles, a shared joke about Copper's stubbornness, the way his hand fit in hers as if each had been carved for the other. As seasons turned, the name of Red Horse traveled in a different currency. It wasn't money that made a place respected, though money helped, but reputation. Riders told other riders the Hale Place trained mounts to hold in a storm. A stage line bought a team after a passing endorsement. The trickle of small sales steadied into enough to pay one lean down, and then another. Travers's influence, once wide as a stain on the paper, frayed at the edges. Rumors reached them that the territorial governor had finally lent an ear to complaints about his methods. Letters from Judge Nakamura arrived with news that Travers had been summoned to Cheyenne to answer for practices that bordered on coercion. The shadow that man had cast over the valley thinned at the edges like a weathered banner. But removal of a threat does not erase scars. Eliza still woke sometimes with the taste of the old paper in her mouth and the echo of coin clinking like a contemptuous chant. She remembered her father's face, not with the warmth of the man who had once taught her to stitch, but with a complicated tenderness, pity softened by disappointment, anger bowed to the need for survival. She forgave and did not forgive. In the sorts of ways that make up the fabric of human life, years braided themselves with work. They buried a colt in a corner of the pasture and planted a willow to lean over it. They kept Judge Nakamura's corrected declaration folded in a drawer where she took it out now and then and smoothed the creases like prayer beads. Copper grew into a steady old gelding who walked with the careful deliberation of something that has seen and accepted the world. When he finally had to be let go because old age had done its slow work, they buried him under the cottonwoods and did not sell him to some man who'd call him currency. That, more than anything, felt like a proof against the world that had once thought she could be bought. They were not a story of wild, headlong romance. Their love was slow, hard-won, durable. It was measured in the making of beds after a long night, in the way Garrett would stand in the rain to wait until she had brought the last pail and been safe, in the way she would greet him with a mug of coffee and a small grin after he'd ridden far. It was a mutuality that made space for each to be both strong and fragile. It was a love that survived the seasons because it had been built to. When Travers's name came up in town, it was often along with a shake of the head now, rather than a whisper of fear. The old bully got his due in the hearing halls up in Cheyenne, and his power ebbed even if it did not vanish entirely. The town's muscle reassembled itself into neighborly muscles, people who handed over rope without looking for a tally in return, who helped with the calf and did not keep account in a ledger. The sheriff began attending community meetings with a steadier spine. The world they lived in remained harsh. It was only a different harshness now, one tempered by a community that had learned how to refuse being bullied. Sometimes Eliza would stand on the porch and watch the lights slide across the fields, and she would think of the girl who had been counted as coin. She would think of a decision that had been rammed into her life, and how she had made it into something chosen rather than endured. In the quiet of those evenings, she would rest her head on Garrett's shoulder and feel the simple miracle of a hand that had learned how to be gentle. He would run a thumb along the calluses at her knuckles and tell a story about a stubborn colt, and their laughter would rise like warm bread steam. They aged into each other the way old red barns weather into something more solid. The world around them kept its bite. Droughts came, winters white and hard, neighbors with troubles and toothaches. But the Hale place endured because their life was a thing of small fidelities, a steadiness that does not shine but that keeps the roof from blowing off. If people told stories of the woman once sold for a horse, they no longer told it as an indictment alone. They told it as the story of a woman who took what was wrong and turned it into a life she had chosen, who took a man who had paid coin to right a wrong and made him a husband who understood that protection is not ownership. They would tell about horses trained to stand in a storm, about Copper and the Willow, about how a town learned the simple courage of refusing to bow to a bully. At night, when the valley was deep and dark and the stars were sharp as flint, they would take their supper to the porch and watch the world breathe. Garrett would tell stories in a quiet voice, about riding the long turns, about a little brother he'd loved and lost, about the foolish things youth had offered him. Eliza would listen and sometimes answer, with stories of her ma's hands and the ways of a kitchen that made miracles from a crust of bread. They would talk of the future in small ways, plans to shore up a fence, to try for a better foal next season, to send a crate of horses to the stage line if the price was right. Occasionally she took out the judge's declaration and smoothed it between her fingers, and sometimes she would fold it back into the drawer and tuck a sprig of dried jasmine beside it. No one ever bought her again. No one ever could. Whatever coin passed hands at Red Horse afterwards was traded for work and steel, and the honest labor of breaking a colt or repairing a roof. The last wrong had been named and amended as far as ink and stubborn hearts could make it so. She had a name, a voice, a husband who might lack poetry but who offered ballast, and a home that was theirs because both of them had kept building it. They had survived storms that would have felled a lesser sort, and they had made a life from a world that loved to take. That was the miracle of it, not that darkness was banished, but that two people kept the light burning between them.